talk a little bit more about his story. And I've already heard just enough of him to want to hear more. So Jarrett, welcome to the podium, and you have the next hour. He assured me that he will wake everybody up. So we're looking forward to that. All right, thank you.
Well, actually,
Jarrett, it's all yours.
Thank you. All right. So when I went to law school, I was there at night. So everybody was ready to go at the beginning of the class, and it was difficult. And I told myself as I sat through boring lecture after boring lecture that if I ever had the opportunity to present, I would try to make sure that I kept you off your phone and awake, right? So I'm gonna do that. That's gonna be my attempt. So I first wanna start out with a video that just encompasses my journey and where I am now, and then I wanna get into another case.
Jarrett Adams wants to right wrongs.
I can shake your hand. They can't keep me from doing that.
In a Wisconsin jail, he meets with his client, whom he believes was wrongfully convicted of rape. He hopes the judge will now free him after 30 years behind bars.
We hope everything will go well, and we're able to just see you walk out of here tomorrow.
Jarrett is not your typical defense attorney. In fact, you could say he knows the law from the inside out.
Although I received my diploma from Loyola Law School in Chicago, I started law school in Green Bay Correctional Facility.
Jarrett was wrongfully convicted himself. He was 17 when he was arrested, accused of sexually assaulting a student at the University of Wisconsin, a crime he denied from the start.
In these cases, there's always that moment of, this will get cleared up very quickly.
You know, my only encounter with the criminal court system was Law and Order. And that theme music comes on, you don't see guys who are wrongfully convicted go to prison.
But Jarrett did, a 28-year sentence, convicted after his court-appointed attorney chose not to put on a defense, even though there was a witness who could have helped clear him.
When this guy is telling us, look, we know you didn't do it, they haven't proven their case, the best defense is a no defense strategy. We're like, yeah, that sounds good, because we don't know any better, right? But in reality, it was a horrible idea.
A cellmate convinced Jarrett to keep fighting. Jarrett spent his days in the prison law library. He wrote letters and finally caught the attention of the Wisconsin Innocence Project. Keith Finley took up his case.
He had done his homework. He knew the case factually better than anybody, and he knew the law. He said, look, the issue we're going to win on is that ineffective assistance of counsel claim. You got to lead with that. You got to argue that.
Jarrett was correct. It was the argument that caused the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals to overturn his conviction. After nearly 10 years in prison, Jarrett was free, reminded, though, by a family photo album of what he'd lost.
I started to just look at the evolution of me as a kid, just, you know, growing up, pre-K, kindergarten, graduation, birthdays, and then I turned the next page, and I didn't see another picture of me until I was 26, 27 years old.
It's like a piece of your life just was erased.
Just forever gone.
But Jarrett's remarkable and at times ironic journey was just beginning. He went to college, graduated law school, and clerked at the same court that tossed out his conviction. And then last summer was hired as a lawyer by the Innocence Project in New York, the same organization that successfully argued his appeal.
What must it be like for you to walk in these doors every day as an attorney?
There is no sweeter joy than to be on this side of the law.
His to-do list, freeing other wrongfully convicted inmates.
This is hopeful, and this is just filed.
Which brings us back to Wisconsin and Jarrett's client, serving time in the same prison Jarrett once did. His name is Richard Baranek.
He's not simply presumed innocent of these crimes. He is innocent.
In June, his conviction was overturned based on new DNA testing. Jarrett's first win as a lawyer.
What's up, man? Where
the handcuffs at? You look free.
And completing this improbable circle, Jarrett's co-counsel on the Baranek case was Keith Finley, the lawyer who helped free Jarrett 10 years ago.
It's this storybook tale that you wouldn't believe until you saw it.
And Keith, you're part of the storybook too. I mean, do you just shake your head sometimes to watch the full circle that Jarrett has been on?
It's incredible. I mean, I've been amazed at every step of the journey.
Nothing pays me back more, or my family more, than me walking in the same court, in the same state, where they didn't even look at me when they gave me 28 years. But now they have to acknowledge me as Attorney Adams.
Attorney Jarrett Adams is the first Innocence Project exoneree that the organization has hired as an attorney. Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out.
Thank you, and thank you, tech guys, for working with me. I know I'm late with these audios and stuff, but again, I wanted to make sure that I kept everyone awake, because what I am getting ready to embark on next is very serious, and I pray that you guys take this with you in your careers and conversations at the water cooler. I told you guys earlier today that I was speaking after doing this segment. I think Sheriff Crawford, had someone reach out to me, and I was speaking at a reentry event, and a lady in the audience came up to me, tears in her eyes, ring in her hands. The papers that she was trying to give me were wrinkled because she was just so nervous to talk to me. And when I looked at her, I couldn't help but to just be reminded of that same woman with those wrinkles and creases of anguish, my mother. And so I listened to her. Now, let me be honest with you guys. There are no kids in here, so I might use a few four-letter words. More than half the people who come up to me talking about they're innocent are full of shit. I mean, it's just the truth, right? But there was something about her, and there was something about the way that she approached me. And I took time to look at this case, and I dispatched 2 paralegals and about 4 law students on this case. And for a year and a half, we investigated this case. And I am telling you that there's a travesty right here in Virginia. And I am hoping today that this is not just a presentation, but that this is something that if you guys do nothing else, go back and ask questions, right? Because I'm not here today to throw stones and shoot arrows. I'm here today to hopefully start a conversation that we must continue to have. Defense attorneys, all attorneys, quite frankly, including you guys on the ground. Look, we're a part of the same foot process on the ground. So with that, I want to show you this next segment that I had no part in, but that I am now a part of this case.
With President Obama. They hope he sees it before he leaves office.
8 News investigator Carrie O'Brien has the story you'll see only on 8.
But our verdict was not guilty of the murder.
A juror in disbelief.
I didn't know them. Never heard their names before.
A former police chief who says no way.
I'll fight till I die.
And a family heartbroken.
You got a raw deal.
3 lives forever changed. Ferron Claiborne, Terrence Richardson, and Waverly police officer Alan Gibson. And it all began in these woods. 25-year-old Officer Gibson was gunned down in these woods behind the Waverly Village apartment complex. Warren Stirrup, the police chief at the time, was one of the first to respond. He has never spoken publicly about it until now. Is Alan conscious at this time?
Alan was completely out. He was laying there, his gun laying on the ground. I picked up his gun and took it up the hill, going toward my car to secure it.
There's a lot of folks that had a lot of questions about when you picked up the gun, because obviously there could be some fingerprints on that gun.
Could be. I didn't think about that at the time.
Stirrup says his military training kicked in. He was worried other officers and deputies responding could also be in danger.
I don't want that gun laying around in case somebody come up and same thing that happened to the deputy.
Officer Gibson, just 25 years old with a wife and daughter, was flown to the hospital but couldn't be saved. Suddenly, there's a cop killer on the loose and pressure to find him.
All available resources are working on this at this hour.
Within a couple days, 27-year-old Terrence Richardson and 22-year-old Ferron Claiborne emerged as suspects.
Rather serious charges.
You understand?
Yes, ma'am.
I didn't know them. We knew who were the players.
To this day, from their prison cells, Richardson and Claiborne maintain they're innocent.
Did you murder Officer Gibson?
No, I didn't.
Did you have any part in that murder?
No, I didn't.
Did you have any part in shooting Officer Gibson?
No, ma'am.
The case in Sussex County Court immediately had problems.
No evidence to tie him to it.
A conviction in doubt, no fingerprints on the gun, contaminated evidence, and the only witness, a convicted felon once on record saying he didn't know anything about the murder. The Commonwealth's attorney at the time, David Chappell, declined to go on camera with 8 News, but told us in an email, "It was frustrating handling the cases because while I believed we had the right 2 criminal agents, the evidence as a whole was very borderline proving murder." Chappell offered a controversial plea bargain. The suspect's lawyers urged them to take it.
He said if you go to trial and you mess around and you lose, you can get the death penalty. I really didn't have the funds to go forward with the trial.
Richardson pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. Claiborne pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact, a misdemeanor.
But he said if I take the misdemeanor charge, that I can get released and go home the same day.
And so he did, thinking all of this was now behind him.
I think I've been blessed.
Or so he thought.
If you want to go and do your little things that are not right and that are against the law, all you got to do is take a police officer's gun, shoot him, and say it was an accident.
Gibson's grieving and heartbroken family did not feel justice was served. And soon, Claiborne and Richardson would find themselves in federal court, facing those murder charges all over again. It almost sounds like double jeopardy, right? You can't be tried for the same crime twice. So how did it happen?
Because there are 2 different sovereigns. The state can try you, and then the federal government can try you for essentially the same thing under the Rinaldi Doctrine.
Tonight at 11, we take a look at the federal case and the problems we've uncovered with it. Carrie O'Brien, 8 News.
All right, so you guys can go and look into that on your own, the rest of the report and stuff like that. But let me preface what I'm about to say by saying this first. My presentation has nothing to do with throwing dirt or shame or talking ill on an officer who passed away in the line of duty. So that's not what I'm on at all. Again, what I'm about to say has nothing to do with about anyone down in Sussex County then or now. I'm up here doing nothing more but stating facts. And so if there's a problem with the facts I'm about to state, I'll apologize in advance, but I didn't make these facts. I'm only stating these facts. So here's what I've uncovered in my office as well. So 8 o'clock a.m., there are several different reports that I've been able to get through FOIA requests, gathering information from different departments and stuff like that. 8 a.m. Whatever I put up on here has been verified fact. And I am welcome, my office is welcome to have coffee, tea, lunch, or dinner so you can dispute anything that I put up on here today. That's just how much I believe in it. 8 o'clock a.m. Terrence Richardson is a young man who's living from house to house. He is born and raised in the Waverly, Virginia area, family all in Waverly, Richmond, stuff like that. Anyone from those areas know. Young black men struggle to find employment, education, and if they don't end up in prison or dead, then they end up on drugs, bouncing from house to house. Terrence Richardson was staying over the house of a guy named Sean Wooden. Remember Sean Wooden, he'll be key later on in this case. So he's staying over the house of a guy named Sean Wooden. They had been partying the night before. He had slept on this man's couch. Sean Wooden has a girlfriend, actually the mother of his child. They have about 2 or 3 kids. All of them are in the house as well. 9:30 a.m., Farron was spotted sleeping over his uncle's house, which wasn't in Waverly at all. It was in walking distance, probably about 20 minutes on foot, because Farron didn't have a car. Probably a little bit longer than that, now that I think about it. Probably was about 30 or 40 minutes, and I think that he rode a bike or something like that. So at 10:20, there are a bunch of different stories as to when Officer Gibson started his tour, where he was coming from, a bunch of different stuff. But I'll tell you this. From all of the documents that I've uncovered, Officer Gibson was not on duty that day. He was down somewhere on a vacation. And he and his girlfriend at the time had gotten to an argument. They ended their vacation, and abruptly, Officer Gibson is trying to take back over his shift on this Saturday. So 10:30 a.m., Terrence is watching TV with the kids in the living room. He woke up at this time, and he's watching some cartoon that he was able to verify through, again, documents that I've uncovered from different agencies. Officer Gibson at 10:46 had taken over his shift after he talked to Sheriff Stirrup and convinced him to let him take over his shift. So he's out at the Sussex Trace Apartments, 10:46. At 10:50, Gibson is back in his unit, and I think he's leaving from these apartments. So this timeline is from when the officer is calling in, when he's reporting where he is and stuff like that. So I ain't making this up. I ain't pulling this out of cloud at all. So 10:57, Officer Gibson is out of his unit. He's on foot in the Waverly Village Apartments. At 11 a.m., there's a guy named Eric Garrett who's crossing through a gangway through the Waverly Village Apartments. Now, me coming from Chicago, when I first heard apartments, projects, I'm thinking about our projects. I'm from the south side of Chicago. We got real projects, all right? From long as you can see, projects. When I got here in Waverly, and I could see from one side of this tree area to where houses and other streets were, I realized something wasn't right. And every report that was talked about on the news would lead the person sitting on their couch to believe that this was some type of forest, right? And you couldn't see inside it, and you didn't know what was going on, and somebody could possibly jump out. That's craziness. And you all can go on your phone, on Google Maps, and you can go look on it on yourself. It's not true. You can throw a rock from where these apartments start and hit a house on the other side, out of the wooded area where they were at. So at 10:50 a.m., the Virginia State Police log indicated a request for a van, and it was like a crime scene, a homicide request for a van. There are disputes as to what time exactly requests came in and what time exactly that the first 911 call came in. What I can tell you is this. It was somewhere between 10:50 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. I can adamantly, all the documents will show you that the officer, the calls that came in were between that time, 10:50 and 11:30 a.m. Let me tell you this. There were reports inside that we were able to find that said that the officer made it to the Waverly complex. He made it to this complex, and when he made it to this complex, he got out of his vehicle, he looked around, then he got back in, and there was a witness who said that about 5 minutes later, he doubled back into this apartment complex. And I asked the lady, I said, how do you know for sure that you saw this? She says, well, look, Mr. Adams, this was Saturday morning, 11. Ain't nobody in these projects open right now. They not up at all. The only people out here are kids playing in the yard. And I said, well, why were you out? She said, listen, we don't have a lot of money down here. So when we have birthday parties for kids, we sweep off our front stoops and we get the birthday cake and we let the kids play to make sure they don't fall on no glass or anything like that. I understood that. So that was one witness right there who had no dog in this fight, no reason to lie, no nothing. But somehow, she didn't really make it to the court to testify to what she had saw to create this timeline of events. So I asked her, what did she see? She said she saw him double back in the parking lot, and the second time he came back in the parking lot, he waved at her, and he parked down at the end of the opening between where the apartments were and where you lead into this little, I'll call it a prairie, because it's not a wooded area, a prairie, right? A few trees, if you talk to some people from down here who see trees a lot, right? So she says that she steps back in, but the kids were still playing, and she's in the living room. And a shot is fired. And that's all she heard was one shot. And there's some kids who come running from back on the other side of the complex, and there was one kid, about 10 years old. And her name is not important at this time, but she hand-wrote a report. She hand-wrote a report, and she says, look, I saw a man with dreadlocks, and he was big, black, and ugly looking. Now, there's a reason why I'm putting in that part, because anybody who has kids, been around kids, they know that when they give details like that, they ain't making it up, right? That's the only description from the only eyewitness in this case that we've ever had. It's easy to talk about wrongful convictions after they've been overturned. We're talking about one that ain't been overturned. And let me tell you how they are preserved. So this statement that this young girl gave, it morphed. Oh, did it ever morph? And I'll show you how it morphed. So now, we have officers arrive on scene. These officers arrive on scene because after this little girl saw what she saw, the police were called. Now, I don't know how many people have been down to Waverly, but from the police station down to these apartments, it ain't far. You can get down there in a matter of seconds. So officers show up on the scene. One of the first people to show up on the scene was Chief Stirrup, who you guys saw in this depiction. So he shows up on the scene. There was another officer who showed up before Chief Stirrup showed up on the scene. So from all accounts, from all interviews that we've done, I'm not quite sure if I accept this, but he didn't say a word when they got there, right? He didn't say anything. Now, you all are in law enforcement. I've never seen someone get shot in the stomach and they're out of it. They don't crawl, they don't do anything at all. And let me backtrack and explain to you how the scene looked. So when these officers that arrived, they came down and they got here to the apartment complex. Officer Gibson was laying face down. His gun was at least 1.5 feet in front of him, right? So he's laying face down, gun 1 foot in front of him. These officers arrive, and the bullet ricocheted off the bottom of his vest, and it went into his hip, and it hit an artery in his hip. So he bled out eventually and died from that. I want to go back again. It didn't take long for these officers to arrive on scene. So I don't know what happened. I do know that in a scene like that, it can be very traumatic for people who are involved, the people who are responding and the people who are on the ground, they're victims and witnesses, all alike. So I don't cast any judgment on certain things because we can't go back and change them. So when Chief Stirrup arrived on the scene, he immediately grabbed Officer Gibson's gun. He takes his gun, he puts it in his patrol car, and he's asking all of the witnesses, including the little children around, who did they see leading up to the time of Officer Gibson back there being shot. They immediately lock on to a guy. They lock on to a guy, and they lock on to a guy, and they lock on to the wrong guy, right? So what the reports say is that they go about 5-6 minutes away. They lock on to a guy that the children said that they seen passing through this gangway before the officer was shot. They bring this guy back, and miraculously, Officer Gibson raises out of seemingly what should be unconsciousness, and he says, no, that's not him who did it. The guys who did it to me, one had dreadlocks, and the other one had a ponytail, right? 2 black men. The only account that was given by an officer who arrived on the scene. And before I get to that slide, I want to say this. There was an officer who arrived on the scene well after 10 to 15 minutes later. I, right now, have a medical expert, pathologist, looking over these documents as to time of death, carotid artery, and all that type of stuff, and how long it takes a person to pass out once they have a severed artery. Because I want him to get me off of how does someone go in and out of consciousness with a severed artery that everything that I found on Google says that you are pretty much in cardiac arrest after about 10 to 12 minutes if there's no pressure applied and no immediate service being done to this wound. So I'm still waiting on that bit of evidence. But again, I'll give you what the reports say. So this officer is a trooper who arrives. This trooper arrives and he says he's able to get a full conversation with Officer Gibson, who again, like I said, miraculously, he pops up out of the dead and is able to give a full account. He says that he saw some suspects, he got out of his car, he chased these suspects in the back of a wooded area, and they managed to wrestle his gun away, shoot him, and they fled. I definitely want to pause there. I think that everyone in this room has some service weapon training or something like that, right? I ask this question. If an officer sees suspects and he gets out of his vehicle, since when do they not call and radio in, bring some backup? Since when does the officer chase a suspect and he not pull out his gun immediately when he's chasing a suspect? I mind you all, this is 11 a.m. in the morning. This ain't at night. It ain't nothing covering anything at all. This is in the morning. So how does Officer Gibson manage to be taken by surprise by two people that from the version of events that was given by the trooper, from these version of events, he had saw the suspects and was getting out of his car to go after the suspects? How? How do they take his gun away, right? How do they take his gun away, shoot him, his gun lands in front of him, he's shot in the stomach, and he doesn't return fire? Not at all, right? How does, if we know Officer Gibson had his gun on him, he had to put it on himself, right? We know that Chief Stirrup picked up his gun at the scene of the crime. And we know from what was alleged that someone was supposedly had to wrestle his gun away from him. So that's three different people, three different opportunities for there to be DNA or anything on this gun. You want to know how many profiles they obtained from this gun? Absolutely none. None at all. Not even Officer Gibson's. There's something wrong. There's something wrong with this. And there's been something wrong with this, right? So how do we get to these two men being suspects? Well, we get here and we get to what is called the hallmark of wrongful convictions. So immediately after this happened, and some can say rightfully so, there is an officer down. The only version of events we have to go off of is what another officer said that he said to him as he was dying, right? So they put out a description. They put this description out and they say, we're looking for some people with dreadlocks and a ponytail. But oh my. That description seemed to change because what happened was there was such a show of force because the victim wasn't just a victim. The victim was an officer who was down in the line of duty. And the response should have been what it was, right? There was a show of force from both state police, local police, everybody came down here, right? But what they did is what happens all too often. They started to round up everybody in the neighborhood who had dreadlocks and a ponytail. That's what they did. Everybody, right? So they put all of these people in different facilities, and they go and they question them, and they questioned one guy named Sean Wooden. Sean Wooden was a guy who had several different cases, both open and closed. And suddenly, he had a story that he himself, along with Terrence and Ferran, met in these apartments, and they were doing a drug deal. The officer snuck up on them. He heard a shot, and he ran off. First, let me tell you this. I don't know anyone in my life who would put themselves at the scene of killing the officer. There was nothing at all to compel Sean Wooden to tell this story besides what I was later able to uncover. Sean Wooden was a guy who was a young black man, and he was trying to hide the fact that he was strung out on cocaine. And he was doing whatever he could to get his fix. And this was a way for him to get his fix. And he mentioned the name of Terrence and Ferron, and from that point on, the very statement that this little girl gave morphed, and it changed. She was never called as a witness for any proceeding, not one. She was not at any grand jury. She was only interviewed by an officer after she handwrote her statement and said that it was a heavy-set, black, dark, ugly guy with dreadlocks. The next statement that was recorded was written by an officer. And in this statement, it went from the description that she wrote out herself to, oh, it was somebody with cornrows like dreadlocks. And the reason they said that is because at the time, Terrence had short braids at the time. They were short. So instead of everyone pausing to find out exactly what happened and getting down to the bottom of it, everyone pivoted and said, the spotlight is on us. How do we close this case, right? I want to take you through the witnesses in this case. Sean Wooden. I talked to you about Sean Wooden before. So as the story mentioned in the segment, Sean Wooden initially said he didn't know anything about nothing at all, and he was at home with Terrence. After being rounded up, he suddenly knew a whole lot. Now, I'm not saying that to say that suspects don't lie, and through great investigation, they turn around and tell the truth. But how is it that someone like Sean Wooden can be so credible when he's making an allegation to close a case, but if I use this same Sean Wooden to reverse the case, I would be laughed out of the courtroom? Why so? Why so? Yvette Newby. Yvette Newby was a witness because her apartment was facing the spot where Officer Gibson was shot. Yvette Newby said that initially she didn't see nothing. She didn't hear nothing, didn't know nothing at all, right? So then there were different officers who started to put pressure on her and told her that, look, we're gonna take your kids. We know you're out here involved in prostitution. And suddenly, Yvette Newby went missing at one point. And then she was discovered a little later, and I'll show you how she became important. This was the young lady who gave the description. She gave the description, and she stuck to that description, and she never made it in front of any court at all. For some reason, she wasn't called by defense attorneys, prosecutors, none of that. And quite frankly, this isn't just on authorities. This is an example of bad lawyering as well. It's exactly what this is. So this is the picture of Terrence and Ferron. As you can see, they do not match the description that was given. They just don't. So we have to ask ourselves, why on earth would this go forward, right? And quite frankly, it didn't go forward. It was another opportunity for a hallmark wrongful conviction to happen. This Eric Lamont Garrett was the person who was walking through the Waverly Village apartments. He was the person that the kids said that they saw right before the officer was shot. I spoke to Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett gave me a full, detailed explanation as to what he was doing, where he was going, and also that he was cutting through these apartments, and that he said that he waved at the officer, but he never stopped to talk to him at all. And when he walked through the gangway leading through this apartment complex, he said he saw no one at all back there at all. And before I can even get a chance to say it, Mr. Garrett said, look, you could see people before you even get back there. If someone was back there, no one was back there. So Javonna Jones is an important witness that I had the opportunity to speak with. Ms. Jones was the child's mother of Sean Wooden. And I struggled I struggled with why Sean would admit or provide a statement like this if it wasn't true. But after having the opportunity to speak with Ms. Jones and get a full view of what was going on, I thoroughly understand what happened and why he did what he did. He was addicted to substances, and he would have said and did whatever, right? So Ms. Jones told me that Terrence slept at their house, that her, Terrence, Sean had been drinking and smoking the night before, and Terrence fell asleep on the couch. She says that when she got up at some point, Terrence was in the living room watching cartoons with the kids. And she says that this was around 11 something, right? Between 11, 11:30, 12 o'clock. She says she knows because she had to do laundry and she had to go to another meeting. So she was out doing laundry and running in and out of the house when there was a guy, a neighbor, who came over and said, "Did y'all hear what happened over there in the Waverly Apartments?" And they said, "No, we don't know what's going on over there." The guy said, "Well, I'm trying to find out as well. There's a lot of police officers over in that area." So immediately, Terrence and Sean hopped on bikes and they rode over to the Waverly Village Apartments. So they were outside along with a bunch of witnesses while police were canvassing the scene and all type of stuff. I've been around some very hardcore criminals, man. I ain't never been around none who kill an officer and then ride back on a bike to the scene. Never been around that type of resolve, right? Head scratcher to me, if you ask me. So Leonard Newby was a name that came up. Leonard Newby just happens to be the brother of Yvette Newby. So Leonard Newby stayed with his sister from time to time. And strikingly, Leonard Newby was a heavy-set, dark-skinned man with dreadlocks. Long dreadlocks, to be exact. And Leonard Newby just wasn't some old suspect. He was a suspect that went to the barbershop the next day and cut all of his dreads off. Somehow, some way, Leonard Newby just missed ever being brought in to a grand jury. You can bring a bag of potato chips in front of the grand jury and ask it questions. So why wasn't Leonard Newby ever asked any questions, right? Aldridge was an officer who showed up first with Chief Stirrup. And, you know, he repeated some of what I believe that Officer Gibson either told him or what another officer told him. Rest in peace, Officer Aldridge is no longer with us. I was unable to track him down. So Chief Stirrup, he's an interesting guy, man. You know, I immediately was so upset and had a head scratcher as to why he would pick that gun up with his hands. And I think that everyone who is a part of law enforcement is thinking the same thing, right? And not only why would he pick the gun up with his hands, but why would there not be any prints on the gun once it was turned over and printed? I mean, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question, right? I don't. I do consider myself a good judge of character, and also just looking at the evidence itself. Chief Stirrup had an alibi. He was at some car wash doing something or something like that. So I don't think he had anything to do with it. But I think that his initial reaction really sent this into a tailspin because the crime scene was disturbed. And the only crime scene was really Officer Gibson laying down in the back of the apartments and his gun. That was the only evidence other than a hair that was located on Officer Gibson's clothing. There was a hair located on Officer Gibson's clothing, and they titled it as Negroid hair. So that's black people hair, curly, white, you know, you guys know. So that hair was tested, and 99.9% came back, not Terrence or not Farron, and they never were able to identify who the hair came from. So the trooper who arrived on the scene I just couldn't explain how he was the only one able to get a full version of events. I just couldn't understand it, you know? I went to multiple different people, and I'm like, man, look, help me understand this. I don't get it. And so I started to kick around, and what I found out was this. This trooper wasn't just some old trooper. This trooper was a childhood friend of Officer Gibson's. They went way back, high school, stuff like that. So they had been knowing each other for years, right? And the trooper was the only one who really gave the version of events of what was supposed to have been said by Officer Gibson. So I started to look more and more. I got some records back from a civil file. Now, Sheriff Sturb was sued civilly, right, by Eric Garrett, who was a witness who walked through. Eric Garrett said that when Sheriff Sturb came upon his house, he snatched him off the porch, he had a gun, so Eric Garrett sued him. I thank God that Eric Garrett sued him, because I probably never would have got these documents that I got right now. So I was able to get more documents from the civil file than I was able to get from any criminal file at all. And that should say something to us in society. So I want to pause and address that. How is it that when someone is facing the aspect of their life being taken away, you get limited discovery, right? Discovery might not even come until the day before, the week before trial. But if I sue you for some money, I can get text messages, your baby mama's number, your mama's favorite baker, all of this information if I sue you civilly. So I thank God that there was a civil suit. I got this file, and me and an investigator from Virginia, an amazing guy named Rod Budd. So Rod has been the one doing a lot of this footwork and stuff like that. He is a former officer himself. And the reason why I picked him is because I've worked with him before. I've known people who've worked with him before. And they said, man, look, if he's going to call a spade, so don't think you're going to hire him to give you an investigation that you won't. If it's not what it is, he's going to tell you, and he's not going to work for you anymore. So to my shock, Rod not only worked for me, but he cut me half off, because that's how convinced he was that something is wrong here. So he started to poke around, and he looked through the file that I gave him, and he says, hey, look, did you ever get your hands on that missing note? And I said, no, and I didn't really think much of it. Where was the note at? He says, well, look, there was a fight between Officer Gibson and his girlfriend and, his wife. And I said, what? And he says, oh, no, he had a girlfriend, but he also had a wife. And I said, wait a minute. So he tells me that there was a fight that was going on that day that he wanted to take his shift, and that there was a note left on the girlfriend's couch before he went on to take his shift. Within 30 minutes to 35 to 40 minutes of taking his shift, Officer Gibson was in the back of these apartments, shot with his gun lying in front of him, right? So we started to hunt for this missing note, and we ran into a roadblock. The department, which I won't name, who has this missing note, has told me that we aren't entitled to the note. I find that mighty suspect. So suspect that I am not in New York with my wife. I'm here presenting in front of you guys. It's been a long time coming that I've been putting these notes together. Now, I'm not in front of you because I'm guessing at anything at all. I'm in front of you because I am telling you the facts as I know them and as I've recovered them, so you can hopefully go out and start asking questions as well. So I still don't know what's in that note. So I started to dig. I wanted to know what's going on here, right? What is this note? Only people I know leave notes are people who are suicidal, or maybe a love note here and there. Didn't have evidence for that, so I didn't want to leap at that, right? So did a Freedom of Information request. Was able to recover a document from 1995 in another part of Virginia. And in 1995, there was a guy who had swallowed 30 pills and also a bottle of liquor, and was discovered by a cleaning lady. And the cleaning lady called the police. And the first responders came and they revived this guy in 1995. And 3 years later, he was hired by the Waverly Village Police Department. And that guy was Officer Gibson. Now, I want to make sure that I explain to you guys, I do not have enough evidence right now to say that this officer shot himself. I don't. I'm trying to find out the same answers that I hope you guys will go on as well. But I do know that none of what I am telling you has made its way into any court, and none of it has made its way into any newscast. And what happens when that happens is opportunities for wrongful conviction. I mean, who do you think is looking at newscasts? Potential jurors, right? So if they're looking at officer down, they got the suspects, and they're doing this old perp walk and all of that type of stuff, there is no presumption of innocence. We cannot kid ourselves at all. And this is troubling because now that I'm asking questions, and I'm asking questions to people who admittedly, they weren't involved at the time that this thing was being adjudicated. But their responses to me isn't, well, you know, look, we stand by the conviction. Their response is, man, look, I didn't have anything to do with that. That's a troubling response. It's very troubling because that means that the people that we have, they don't believe in justice. They believe in finality and preserving their careers and not the truth. I, again, am attempting not to offend anyone. I gave a woman a promise in a church in Petersburg, and I'm making good on that promise to ask these questions. So what ended up happening was this: bad lawyering. The lawyers who were hired to represent these guys convinced them that they should take a guilty plea because they sure enough would be put to death. Now, I could say, you could say, man, there's no way I plead guilty to the death of an officer if I didn't do it. But if you facing a real prospect of being put to death in an electric chair, I think you might consider that, right? So these guys pled guilty and they thought it was over with. Well, let me tell you something about relevant conduct. So once the case was technically over with, and I'll pause as well with that, since when does any Commonwealth attorney or any prosecutor agree to a plea in an officer's death, other than a plea of first-degree murder, right? Farron was given accessory after the fact. Terrence was given like some manslaughter. I forgot the exact code of the charge, but it only required him to do about 3 or 4 years in prison. Farron was released that day, as you saw from the depiction of the news. He was released that day, and he thought it was over with. But no one told him about the federal courts. No one explained to him about relevant conduct. So about 16 months later, Farron and Terrence were indicted, but this time in federal court. So this indictment didn't just come, right? There's a number of things that factor into why it came and why it often comes, right? The mother of Officer Gibson wanted answers, and deservingly so. I make sure that I am very clear when I tell you this. I say nothing I say up here at all to be disparaging to an officer who died in the line of duty. I'm just stating facts. And his mother, like any mother in this audience, would have wanted answers, especially if she's being fed a story that the 2 guys that they had were no doubt the right guys, right? She was misled, and she too was a victim in this case. So they are indicted. They don't have any money. They are appointed, court-appointed attorneys in federal court. It's a different ballgame in federal court. I got a number of federal cases. Well, quite frankly, I ain't going to do trials in federal cases. I'm going to do sentences, because when the feds investigate you, they take a long time and they usually get you, right? It's very thought out, it's very thorough. So in this case, suddenly, these guys are indicted on a federal case. And now the basis of the federal case is that they are big-time Waverly drug dealers. That was the basis of the conspiracy. And not only were they big-time Waverly drug dealers, but they also were involved in the killing of Officer Gibson. So they were able to be retried for the killing of Officer Gibson along with these drug charges. And I want to tell you something about these drug charges. I spent time with these men's family, with their girlfriends, with their kids. I've pulled records, tax returns, all that good stuff. If they were drug dealers, they were merely practicing because they didn't have not one damn cent to their name. Not one. Terrence's mother was still buying him underwear at the time that he was arrested. Ferran was living from couch to couch to couch between here and Richmond. He didn't have a dime. None of them had any bank accounts. They never were caught with any drug paraphernalia. They were never in any informant statements before this at all. But don't be shocked and don't be dismayed, because this same RICO statute has been a statute that is the reason why we have mass incarceration. There are a number of different people that I knew on the south side of Chicago who used to ask me for quarters on their way to the penny candy store, but then they were in an indictment years later and they were being given kingpin statutes, right? And a kingpin statute is where you're supposed to be. I don't know if how many of y'all are familiar with the movie New Jack City, but there's a character named Nino Brown, right? So I use that reference because Nino Brown was this big drug dealer who ran the city of New York in this movie, and every one of these guys who was indicted, they were made to look like Nino Brown. But people in the community knew that they were as broke as they looked, right? So the federal prosecutor at the time was a budding prosecutor, looking to move up in his career. And so he tried this case, and he tried it by using a bunch of people who all received deals to say, I bought drugs from them on this day, on that day, on this day, on that day. Nothing at all verified any account that these guys ever testified to. But in federal court, you don't have to have that. All you have to have is the witnesses saying, I bought drugs this day, I bought drugs that day. Again, no physical evidence at all was used in this case. So with that, they were tried along with this murder. They were found guilty of the drugs, but they were found not guilty of the murder on a federal court. These are the feds we're talking about. People who turn over every rock, present every piece of evidence, and they were found not guilty. So relevant conduct is something that is foreign to a lot of people. Relevant conduct has chopped off the heads of many people, black people to be exact. So relevant conduct is something that you can use to enhance a sentence. So if I try you for drugs and a murder, and you beat the murder, but are found guilty of the drugs, I can use merely the accusations or the guilty plea that you entered into to enhance your sentence. As a result of the guilty plea that these boys entered into, they have been in prison for the last 24 years based on that. So meanwhile, while everyone is getting out on reduced drug charges and First Step Act and stuff like that, they're not getting out because they still have these guilty pleas that need to be reversed down in Waverly. So this is a I'm not gonna even show this because we're getting ready to close it out and let you guys leave. So I told you guys earlier about my grandfather and him being down from Mississippi. It's me right here? Yeah. Thank you. So, and he was a character, man. I love my grandfather to death. And I really feel like he ain't belong in no city. He was not a city boy. I mean, he was country to his heart. But my mothers and my aunts, we would all convene on Sundays, and man, they would get to arguing. It doesn't matter what they would argue about. They would just get to arguing, and that's usually how the dinner would end on the Sunday. So he would stand up out of his lazy boy recliner, and he would say, look, cut this shit out. You arguing about your shit, she arguing about her shit, and neither one of y'all understand shit that either one of you all are talking about. So I used to hear him say this so much, and when I would think about him, I decided to take it a little bit step further. So, Ferron and Terrence are in that dog shit situation right there on the sidewalk. There are people who walk past it, and they just keep going. And there are people who walk past it, and they're like, man, somebody need to clean it up. But then there are other people who walk past, don't see it, and they step in it. And all of a sudden, they are fully invested in the shit. They have sympathy and empathy for the shit because they've had to stop, wipe their shoe off in the grass, and on their way along, they're looking at other people with dogs saying, boy, if you leave some shit, I'm gonna tell you about yourself, because they know what it's like to have that shit on their shoe. We shouldn't wait to step in some shit to say something is bullshit. And that's exactly what this case is down in Waverly. I've made good friends, good contacts here in Virginia. And I can't thank you enough, Sheriff Crawford, for continuing to invite me and give me platforms. And I know I ain't telling you nothing that all these people in here don't know. You are an amazing woman, and your legacy will live on and on and on. So I thank you for giving me this opportunity. I want to read you a story that this lady from Duke Law School came up and told me about after I gave a presentation like this. She says, look, you need to end with this story. Some people are going to accept what you're saying, and some people aren't. They aren't. They're just not going to be able to get it. So she told me this story, and I've used this every time that I've closed out my presentations. This is a story about 4 people named everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done, and everybody was sure that somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. Everybody thought anybody could do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when nobody did what anybody could have. That's a true, true story in our society. I'm gonna close this thing how I opened it. Look, I don't have this type of evolution without the community, all right? It would be very easy for me to sit up here and stick my chest out like a 10-foot peacock and tell you I did all of this on my own, but that's not the truth. I had people, both white and black, help me, and that taught me so much in my career and how I present. We don't need somebody, we don't need everybody, we definitely don't need nobody, we need everybody. That's what we need. This stuff is a slippery slope. Don't think for a second that what has happened to Terrence and Ferron can't happen to your niece, your nephew, or somebody like that. I've realized that look, this ain't about, what you know. This is about who you know, right? This is about who you know. Somebody thought that these boys' lives just wasn't that important, and nobody was gonna kick up a fuss. I do this segment in honor, actually, of Officer Gibson, because we need to know what happened. His family needs to know what happened, and most certainly, Ferron and Terrence need to know what happened. This is my contact information. If there is anything that I have presented today that you want me to verify, I will FedEx it to your office, right? You will get it. You are welcome to call me on anything. I enjoy feedback. I'm a young man, 38 years old, still growing, hoping to have a long-lasting legal career. There's a lot that I can learn. So if there's any feedback that you guys have, please tell me. But don't tell my mother I was cursing, okay? Because she would lay into me if she found out I was doing all this cursing down here, okay? Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Jared, thanks for being here today, and we appreciate your presentation, and certainly gives us something all to think about. Well, certainly it's been a good day. Tomorrow morning we start off at 7:30 for breakfast, and we end the room here for a tomorrow morning session beginning at 8:30 sharp. So have a good evening. Hope you enjoy some time in Williamsburg, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. Thank you very much for being here. I'm calling you.